All right, everyone. Today we're going to talk about Ludwig Feuerbach. Feuerbach was a student of one of the most seminal philosophers in all of history, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. I was initially going to assign Hegel to you, but I'm going to be honest with you, the readings would have been far too challenging. Feuerbach is not the sort of individual that we would be usually studying in an intro to philosophy class. That is very unfortunate because I think that his insights, his critique of religion, how he ends up posing the question of alienation, which in many ways is central to what philosophy ends up becoming in the 19th and 20th century, some of the most important questions, even though formulated in different forms, you can really, just see that what unites them all is really this profound crisis, this split, this disconnection that exists at the existential level of the human being. And Feuerbach, following Hegel, here and there employing his methodology, his dialectical way of working out things, is someone who poses this question of alienation, specifically its religious dimension, in a way that's very interesting, in a way that's central for what is going to become one of the most important intellectual traditions, which is Marxism. Marx and Engels, of course, they both consider themselves very early on Feuerbachians, left Hegelians, students of Feuerbach. And it is only through tarrying with Feuerbach, through engaging critically with his work and growing beyond it, taking the rational kernel from it and leaving behind the mystical shell, that they're able to then subsequently develop Marxism proper, really the worldview of dialectical materialism and the insights that it produces in the study of history and society, which is historical materialism. But Feuerbach is central, and to be brief, I want to share the key insights of the essence of Christianity. This text is published in 1842 at the high point, of anywhere from between 1839 to 1842 of the young Hegelians, of the left Hegelians. And Feuerbach was, of course, the most advanced of them, the one that took the critique of religion farthest. Feuerbach starts by asking the question, what does it mean to be human? Which is a very interesting question, because what he's going to tell us is that the answer is in consciousness, but consciousness in the strict sense. And what does he mean by that? Consciousness in the strict sense. He's going to tell us within a few pages that what he means by consciousness in the strict sense is this ability of thinking to sort of recoil upon itself, to reflect and make itself an object of thought. What makes humans humans for Feuerbach is this unique capacity to end up asking the question, what does it mean to be human? And it's very interesting because through the question itself, we end up giving ourselves the tools for answering it. It is the question that is the answer to the question. Because no other animal, no elephant, no dolphin, no octopus, irrespective of how smart they are, of how capable they are in their thinking, is capable of asking itself the question, what does it mean to be an octopus? What does it mean to be an elephant? What does it mean to be a dolphin? These are very intelligent creatures, but they don't have that extra reflective capacity that humans do. So Feuerbach is going to say that what makes us truly human is consciousness in the strict sense, which means this reflective consciousness, this positing as a question our species as such. It is our ability to make our species essence, our species being, Gattungswesen. It is the capacity to make that an object of thought that makes us uniquely human for Feuerbach. And when we do that, we find that there are certain central characteristics to the species. He's going to name three: our capacity to reason, our capacity to love, and our capacity to will. He says in the species, since these are characteristics of the species, these exist infinitely. They exist perfectly. However, something very interesting ends up happening. At the individual level, on the everyday lives, we don't experience individual perfection in these areas. We often experience deep imperfections that cause, very uncomfortable feelings for us. We'll be with a partner and, we recognize that there's many ways in which we could be better. We can buy them more flowers. We can not be unfaithful. We can, in terms of love, we can, visit our sick grandma more frequently. She expects us every Sunday, and man, how do we feel when it's been 6 weeks and we don't visit her? That's a recognition of an imperfection in our ability to love. The same thing with reasoning. When you get an exam back and you have an 8 on it, or you have a 9, and you studied enough to expect a perfect grade, that imperfection is unsettling. As is the case with will. How many of you, I'm sure, I'm amongst them, you've set yourself up a diet, you say, okay, this is the stuff I'm going to eat, this is the stuff I'm going to stay away from. And then your mom and dad come to your house and they bring you a freshly baked pie, or your favorite chocolate bar, which for me is the Twix, the left Twix. There's no right Twix, just left Twix for me. And you end up breaking your diet. And that's an experience of imperfect will. So when these things happen, they can be very troubling. They bring us a sense of shame often. They make us feel, excuse my French, quite shitty about ourselves. And there's different ways that people cope with this. Some people go have a conversation with Jack. Who knows who Jack is? Yep, Jack Daniels. That's a frequent one that I get from students. When you feel this sense of shame, what do you do? And there's a lot of people that say, I go bar hopping. That's a way to cope with it. We eventually find that these more superficial ways to cope with these feelings, they don't actually produce any substantial, they're not substantial coping mechanisms. They always leave us, ultimately coming back and feeling still ashamed, feeling still shitty about what we did. Especially, if what you coped with was drinking, especially the day after, the day of the hangover, you might even feel worse because now you have not just the recognition of the imperfection, but how you coped, the imperfect way of coping with the imperfection. So Feuerbach is going to say that one of the most successful ways to cope with this troublesome shame that we feel as we experience in an immediate sense, as we have before us the very imperfection in our inability to reason, love, and will perfectly, one of the most successful ways to cope with it is by saying, I'm only human, right? Which, what does that mean? It means this imperfection is not just mine as an individual, it's an imperfection of the species. To be human is to be imperfect, right? To be human is to imperfectly love, imperfectly will, and imperfectly reason. I mean, there's songs after this. I'm only human after all, don't put the blame on me. Excuse my singing, but I get you, I think you get the point. It's a very central and I think the most successful way of coping with this very imperfection. And what Feuerbach is going to say is that, well, when we do that, when we say, look, I'm only human, right? I cheated, I messed up, I'm sorry, I'm only human. It was temptation, I was tempted. I mean, it happened to Adam and Eve, who am I? When we say that, what we essentially do is project our imperfection onto the species as a whole. And what Feuerbach is trying to say is that, well, these characteristics are central to what it means to be human. So their limits are the limits of humanity itself, of the species. Within the species as a whole, they exist perfectly. So when we cope as individuals with our imperfection and project it onto the species, what we have essentially done is reduce the perfection through which these different characteristics exist in the species as qualities of the species, reduce it to the level of being something imperfect. We project our imperfections onto the species. But what happens, for instance, when you receive an exam back which some of you have received it this week, and you have an imperfect grade and you have an 8 instead of a 10. Why does the 8 bother you? Anyone? Yep. Because it's not a 10. Because the 8 bothers you because you know that there's the 10. You know that the perfection is there. That perfection exists, that it's possible. And so, the point of bringing up this example is that we project the imperfection onto the species. We say it's only human to be imperfect, but we still have the conception of perfection. We still know how we could have reasoned perfectly, how we could have loved more perfectly, how we could have willed more perfectly. And what ends up happening when we have that conception of perfection nonetheless present? We end up having to find the source for it. And what's the source? God. So this is the essence of Feuerbach's critique of religion. By coping with our imperfection in a manner that projects those onto the species, we nonetheless sustain the idea of perfection, and in order to find an entity where that a source for that perfection, we create God. God is this being that actually embodies perfect reason, perfect love, and perfect will. And what God is that? That is the Christian God, right? What is the Christian God? He's omniscient, so all-knowing, perfect reason. He's omnipotent, so all-powerful, right? Perfect will, in other words. And he's omni-loving. He's got perfect love. The Christian God is a God that is all-loving, all-knowing, and all-powerful. So for Feuerbach, to sort of retrace our steps, what it means to be human is to ask ourselves that question. When we do that, we find that central to humanity are reason, love, and will. As individuals, we participate in these things imperfectly. To cope with the shame that that imperfection brings us, we export it, we alienate it onto this entity of God. And then once it's there, we end up assuming this figure, this abstraction of God that we have created as the entity where perfect reason, love, and will exist. And Feuerbach is going to say that while that's a general characteristic of religion, there's something very special about the Christian religion. In many ways, as the contemporary philosopher Slavoj Žižek would say, Christianity is the true atheism. Because in Christianity, God himself is killed. God himself is killed. You have the Trinity in Christianity, of course, which is what? The Holy Spirit, the man, and the Father. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, right? And they're not 3 separate entities. They're one. And one of those ones, the Son, dies on the cross. So quite literally in Christianity, you have the death of God. God dies on the cross. And of course, in that moment right before death, he of course questions the Father. There's doubt in God himself about God, right? So this is a very interesting operation. We usually think that the doubting is somewhere in between. The gap is in between us and God. But in Christianity, we have the doubt inscribed in God himself. God doubts himself. And this is, we're not going to get into it, but this is an alignment with the idea of ontological incompleteness, that the gap is not between the subject and the object, but in the world itself. It's an ontological incompleteness. And it comes, of course, from Žižek and from his reading of Hegel's critique of Immanuel Kant and his reading of the Ding an sich, the thing in itself. So for Feuerbach, religion is this source of the problem of man that is just troubling all philosophy in 19th and later on in the 20th century. In the 20th century, we see it with the phenomenologists, with Husserl. I think it's hard to read his text, The Crisis in the European Sciences, without, reading it as a reflection on this question of alienation. We definitely see it in Max Scheler. Scheler, of course, is in his text Ressentiments. He's pondering over similar questions as to what are the foundations for this seeming incompleteness, the seeming crisis that exists at the level of the individual. With Heidegger, we have it as a state of fallenness that humanity has come into. This form of inauthentic existence. And these are all, I think, different ways of thinking about the crisis of the human, which is the question of alienation. And I think Feuerbach is one of the first people to really pose it in a poignant manner in his critique of religion. He's going to say that the root then of the crisis of alienation is found in religion, in the way in which we project our essence onto God as a way of coping with our imperfections. And so what's interesting then about Christianity is that, well, God dies, so it's the first atheist religion, and what's left in the aftermath of God? It's the Corpus Christi. It's not just a city here in Texas. It's the body of Christ, the church, which isn't just a physical institution that you go to. It's the community of human beings whose relationship as a community is mediated by love, and a specific type of love, Christian love, which is agape. It's a very communal, in many ways, socialistic love that governs the Corpus Christi. And in Catholic theology, at least, the presence of God is manifested through love. God is love. God is love in community. The faithful man, the man of God, the pious man, is not he who claims to believe in God and then doesn't care about anyone else. The real pious man is the one that actually cares about other people, that loves their neighbor, even if they have no conception of God. If he loves their neighbor, he loves God, and God is there in that love and community. So for Feuerbach, Christianity is special because of these reasons I just mentioned. And what he ends up then providing us in a very fascinating manner is an inversion of the Imago Dei. You have, of course, in the Christian tradition, this conception that humanity, that man, is made in the image of God. In Feuerbach, it's the opposite. It is God that is made in the image of man. Because what God is, fundamentally, is this projection of what it means to be human. And in Christianity, that projection comes back onto us, because we're the Corpus Christi, and we're supposed to participate in the life of Christ. These bracelets, a couple decades ago, used to be quite popular. The "What Would Jesus Do" bracelets. It's a commitment to living the life of Christ, to striving to sort of be like Christ. It's kind of interesting, as you know, I'm Cuban, and in Cuba we have a similar saying with with another Christ-like figure, Che Guevara. Before schools, the Cuban students, what they say is, "Pioneros por el comunismo, seremos como Che." Pioneers for communism strive to be like Che. And that strive to be is very similar to the "What Would Jesus Do?" It's an aspirational way of thinking about how it is that we should operate in our everyday lives. And central to that is reasoning, is loving, especially loving and willing, participating in the way of Christ through those three central pillars. And so what you have with Christianity then is this unique circumstance where we have the same projection, the same alienation of the human essence, of the Gattungswesen, onto God, but it comes back to us because we're supposed to participate in it. Except it's not a participation that is conscious of the fact that we're participating in our own essence, right? It is a participation in our own essence that is mediated by this creation of God. And so while we're participating in our own essence, what we think we're doing is participating in the essence of God. And so this is the big aha moment of Feuerbach's philosophical and theological anthropology, this inversion of the central guiding assumptions around the question of God, the question of religion. And in the young Marx, we'll talk about this next week, but I want to just premise a few remarks. The young Marx is also dealing with the question of alienation. What is it that's going on at the human level that has created such a miserable existence, such a dehumanizing form of life for many, many people? And this isn't just a question of, I would say, the 19th century, even though it really becomes central for philosophy at that time. Already in the late 18th century, in the Scottish Enlightenment, which is interesting because the figures of the Scottish Enlightenment, most principally Adam Smith, they're taken up by libertarians today as fetishists of markets and capitalism, etc., etc. But that wasn't the case at all. Adam Smith, as a political philosopher, was committed to a project of justice, and he presumed that it is through the invisible hand of the market that justice could be achieved. And his main concern was not state intervention, but the intervention of capitalists. And he calls out capitalists, he's not calling them capitalists, he's calling them masters, because the term capitalist hadn't existed. He's calling out landlords, who he calls parasites, and capitalists as well. And he calls out their hypocrisy. He says, you fight against the workers unionizing, but you yourself are constantly uniting and combining and doing what you have to do in order to interfere in markets to make them act on your behalf. That's what he was concerned about, would overthrow the balance, the ability of the visible hand to produce justice. The capitalist, not necessarily the state. But you have an Adam Smith following the figure, of course, of Adam Ferguson. Today we don't hear about Adam Ferguson. If you read Marx's Capital, which I recommend you all do, it's a text I don't think many professors are going to recommend you read, but it's one of the most brilliant texts ever written by any human being. There's a bunch of references to this figure, Adam Ferguson, who, doubtfully you'll find in any course on the history of philosophy, a very brilliant and forgotten figure. But Adam Smith takes his humanistic critique of the crippling of man, the crippling of humanity that's produced by this industrial development. He takes that from Adam Ferguson. So in many ways, this crisis of the human being, this sort of gap and incompleteness that philosophers are really making central to their projects in the 19th and 20th century, this incompleteness in man, you can trace it back to the late 18th century. Of course, Adam Smith writes his The Wealth of Nations in 1776, the same year as our revolution. Ferguson is writing a little bit before that. And here we have, again, an understanding of the crippling of humanity, of the process of becoming simply cogs in a machine. Instead of developing our abilities in a plentiful manner, we become less human as industrial development is carried out. And we have to, of course, look for mechanisms to undo that. Adam Smith suggested, schooling and different other forms of more reformist types of solutions. So this analysis isn't necessarily unique. It doesn't start in the 19th century. Many thinkers had already noticed it well before, already in the most embryonic stages of industrial capitalism. Thinkers were seeing the underbelly of progress, right? So with Marx, the question of alienation is taken up again, especially the young Marx. And just to hint a little bit at what we're going to be talking about next week, instead of seeing this process of religious projection as the source of alienation, Marx is going to say that is the opium. We have confused this quote, religion is the opium of the masses, as a sort of dogmatic atheism in Marx. It's not. It's not at all. In fact, opium was used as a sort of medicine. Marx himself, at various points in his life, used opium. So opium was a way to cope with the harshness of reality. And for Marx, if we want to really get to the question of alienation, you don't go to the alienation that's threefold times disconnected that we participated in order to escape from the harshness of our reality. In order to critique heavenly alienation, we must first understand how it is that the conditions for heavenly alienation are created in earthly alienation. So he turns the analysis of alienation, of this disconnection, away from religion as the centerpiece of it, even though he still considers that there's alienation there. But much more important is analyzing the conditions for the possibility, to use a Kantian expression, for that religious alienation. And that's the harshness, the difficulties of reality itself, which are rooted in the economic mode of production, in the capitalist form of life, where we find various forms of alienations that are central to everyday life. He's going to depict four, principally: the alienation of the worker, which is the vast majority of society, from the product of their labor. None of us have any say with what's done with the thing that we produce. The alienation of the worker from the process of production. We don't have any say whatsoever, any control over how it is that we produce. The alienation of the worker or of humanity from itself, because you have this division in humanity, this pitting of man against man, this exploitation of man by man, where the species is quite literally fractured in two, into those that exploit and indebt and enrich themselves off of that, and into those that work and experience the other two forms of alienation. If my product and the process of production I am not in control of, someone else is, and that someone else is the capitalist. And lastly, our alienation from our Gattungswesen, from our species essence, which is a concept that Marx takes from Feuerbach, especially the younger Marx. It doesn't really stay later on. He switches it for other concepts, but I think it's still something that we can kind of see in the Marxist conception of humanity, central for which is the ability not to have this reflective process of consciousness. That comes way after. Central to what it means to be human is labor. Labor, our ability to exert our energies, our powers onto nature creatively, in accordance with aesthetic pleasure, in accordance with planning, right? Spiders do spider webs, bees do beehives, beavers do dams and all these different things, but none of them plan. None of them are capable of doing anything else. Humans are capable of doing a multiplicity of different things. We plan it. We often do it in accordance with aesthetic principles and judgments. We do it communally, collectively often. What that process looks like is the objectification of ourselves. That's what is central to humanity. Our ability to objectify ourselves, to imbue with our own subjectivities onto nature, who it is that we are, to objectify ourselves onto nature in a way that produces something unique and meaningful. Marxists are not against work. They're against alienated and exploitative, compulsive work. In many ways, what's central to what it means to be human is to be a homo faber, a tool-using, a tool-creating animal. There, Marxism is in agreement with Benjamin Franklin, who also had the same conception of the human being. So, for Marxism, then, the question of alienation becomes an economic question. How it is that in the forms of intercourse that are central, foundational for capitalist society, we have the disconnection of the worker from the product and the process of production. We have the disconnection of humanity into capitalists and workers, and we have the disconnection of those workers from what it means to be human, from their species essence, from the ability to treat work as an expression of what it means to be human. Work is reduced from a uniquely human activity to something we merely do for the sake of something else. We feel at home, not in our humanly functions, but in our animal functions. It is when we're screwing, when we're just passively enjoying TV or something like that, or drinking. In our more base and animal functions, that's when we feel human and enjoyment. But in our creative and uniquely human functions of labor, that just feels like something necessary, something we do for the sake of having free time. And in that free time, we're so tired that we don't even want to do creative projects. We just passively consume stuff. So, all right, so that's the lecture for today. We're going to take a short 5 to 10 minute break. We'll come back and we'll discuss.